Hello, hello. James, how are you?
Good. How are you, Cassian?
I'm doing really well. I am so glad to have you back on the podcast.
I'm excited to be back. Yes, it's good.
This topic today is so timely. I wanted to say before, I feel like there's a motif going on, and this is mostly a personal one, but on the idea of Jewishness and Christianity and where that overlaps. And I think that this is more of like a personal thing because I'm Christian, my friends are Jews. There's a lot of anti-Semitism going on. And not that I don't love my Jewish friends, but where's like the religious significance? You know how to love your neighbor in the Bible. And I feel like going to church, you're around your Christian friends or your Christian family, but we don't really get taught on how to love your Muslim or your Jewish or your Buddhist or Hindu. You don't really be told how to really appreciate their faith because I guess in the back of my head, I'm like, well, they're not of my faith. So how's it hard to appreciate their faith? And that being said, Jesus was a Jew. All of this kind of came from Judaism and then it became Christianity. And I think what I'm really missing personally is that link between the two. So I'm really excited about the topic today because we're going to be exploring Jewishness in the Bible.
Yes, and maybe I can speak to a couple of issues that maybe cause that separation for us in the modern world. When we think about New Testament studies and Christian studies, a lot of folks that deal with Christian theology and even a lot of people that are New Testament professors are only marginally aware of the Hebrew Bible and the Jewishness that's involved in the Hebrew Bible and its relationship to the New Testament. For years, to develop a New Testament professor, a person would take, a lot of Greek, a lot of theologies as they relate to the Gospels and Pauline letters, Johannine letters, maybe even Revelation. It depends on the person's preference there, probably, and maybe their own denominational preferences. But, the Gospels, Pauline literature would be big parts of the theological training for a New Testament professor. The Greek language would be primary. But the typical degree program would not involve Hebrew grammar, Hebrew
And so that would
texts,
exclude the Jewish faith.
not necessarily, but it excludes a large body of literature being examined at the same level that the New Testament's being examined with. And because it's excluded simply because the language isn't learned in the degree program and the texts aren't studied in their original context, that it leaves a gap in the learning process for the average typical New Testament professor.
Okay,
So,
maybe I'm a bit confused, but you're
yeah,
saying the Bible was translated in Greek and Hebrew. And in the Greek versions, you're getting the Johannine, the New Testament, the Pauline, all of like the Gospels, but in a certain language that is maybe more understandable. But when it comes to that version in Hebrew, it's not as well understood. Or is that a completely different set of books?
it's a different set of books.
Oh,
So the Hebrew Bible is from Genesis to Malachi, and we
oh,
call it the Old Testament, generally speaking.
oh, okay.
And then the Greek begins with the Gospel of Matthew and goes to Revelation.
Oh, why was that separated like that? Was that like a timely thing?
Big time difference. So, like when
Oh,
Moses is writing the books of Moses, it's about 1450 years before Christ, give or take a few decades.
14
So
to
it's
1500 years before Christ, Moses was writing the New Testament.
the
I'm sorry, the Old
Genesis,
Testament.
yeah, the Torah, the first books of the Old Testament. So this is a thousand and a half, a millennia and a half before Christ. Moses sits down and writes these
I'm
books, and
sorry if
then
this is confusing, but was the Torah a part of a book of the Bible or and then now it's become just Jewish faith just reads the Torah?
the Torah is the name for the first five books. The book Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as a set are the Torah.
Today, that is still consistent.
That's the Torah, yes.
What? Oh my gosh. I
Yes.
had no idea. So the Torah and the first five books of the Old Testament are the same
Same
writings?
thing, yes.
What? But it's in Hebrew.
Yes.
How
The,
is our faith different? It sounds like we're reading the
the,
same stuff.
We should be more similar than probably how things have turned out. That is the Torah, or the main text for Judaism, as it is the same books that we have in our English Bibles as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Why didn't I know this before? This is so cool.
It's okay. So Moses is writing that about 1500 years before Jesus comes, right?
Yeah.
So in between those 1500 years, the Psalms are written. David writes the Psalms. Different prophets write some of the prophetic books. Isaiah, and some of them are earlier. Jeremiah's later, and then finally at the tail end is Malachi and Joel and Habakkuk and some of those guys. So all of those are written in a time period of about 1,000 years, from
Okay.
about 1450 before Christ to about 440 or 450 before Christ.
And then no
So
writings for those like remaining 400 years.
that's the question. What got wrote in between there, and what is it, and how valuable is it for our study? There's actually quite a few books that were written in between, but those are what we call Second Temple Jewish literature. So you
Okay.
have, in some Bibles, they have a bunch of those books, at least 14 of them, and they might be called apocrypha. That's another word that's used to talk about those books that are not part of the Hebrew Bible per se, and they're not part of the New Testament, but they're in between.
Okay.
Some of those
Where are they
books are
located then?
historical. You can get them you can go buy a copy of the Apocrypha, and
Oh, but they're not in the Torah and they're not in the Bible.
they're not in the Torah. They're not in the Tanakh, which is the whole Old Testament. So they're not in that either. And they're not in the New Testament. And some English Bibles do include them in a little section in between. They'll just call it the Apocrypha if they do. Most English Bibles don't. They don't include it. And one of the first reasons that they were not included, because the first Bibles, they all had it. And
Yeah.
then when the printing press was invented, and especially when commoners wanted their own Bible, they took those out because they didn't consider them canonical anyway. They
What's
figured they
that
would
mean?
save on costs by not
Oh,
including them.
economical.
Economical, yes.
Okay. Okay. So you're
After
saying,
several centuries, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I'm just trying to like filter this back because this is so much and my brain is moving slow today. So you're saying that is a whole section that was originally in the original text of the Bible that maybe like a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 people have read, but us today are missing a huge chunk of the original couple books of the Bible. They're just not really talked about. They're not known. They're not part of the faith, but they were in the original formation of the Christian faith.
That's the tricky part. They were around, but who considered them Bible? That was the hard part. Did
Oh, so they could
everyone
have just
think?
been like historical text.
Yeah, and so once the Jewish canon was solidified, they did not include those books. And
Canon?
so a canon is like a list of books that are certified as accurate and true,
Oh,
inspired by God, and so forth. And
okay.
so there was a council that took place around the Sea of Galilee by the Pharisees uh, sometime after a lot of the New Testament had come out, and
I,
they made a council to think back all the Jewish books and uh, close the canon, so to speak, on which books are considered for religion and practice. When they did that, they did not pick any of those books. And it's also, when you read them, it's not 100% certain that you want to use them in church anyway,
I
as
got.
as doctrinal or practice books, or books to grow from, because they don't always speak to issues that are relevant for growing one's faith on. They are often very good historical books,
I was
um,
just about to say they're probably worth the read, but it
worth the
doesn't
read.
mean. I think, yeah, in my head, and that's just me being in between the millennial and Gen Z. I immediately go to it's the church wanting to hide something, so they took out the book. They want to control our. I go to the conspiracy theory, but that's interesting. I've definitely heard that there are books of the Bible that They're really hard to find. They're locked away in some vaults in the Vatican, whatever it might be. And that's good to hear that it just the end game of them not being included was because they were going to be more distracting than they were forming in your faith. But is this would be like the Book of Enoch? Is that
That's an example. Actually, that one is not usually in some apocrypha lists either, but that was also a piece of literature from that time that's probably relevant for our study. What I think of about the Apocrypha and other Second Temple Jewish literature books is that they were important enough for first century people to be reading and thinking about it, that also our New Testament authors were familiar with them and the ideas within them, sometimes quoting from them, sometimes depending on their logic, that they're useful. Whether we should be using them, let's say, to make the Sunday morning sermon from or not, that's a different question. But
mm,
using them to help us better understand both the Hebrew
yeah.
Bible and the New Testament, I think is helpful.
So they were
Uh,
more contextually useful at the time when people were kind of going from Old Testament to New Testament. The people that were kind of living at the time of the New Testament were saying, this is good context for us. This is relevant for us at this time period. Whereas today it's unrelatable. We wouldn't be able to really understand it or see why it was important.
they're easy to dismiss, honestly, because we don't see, for example, sermons arising from them and things like that. But they're useful to understanding two things, at least that I've been able to tell, how Daniel's prophecies actually get fulfilled, because we don't see them get fulfilled inside the chapters of the Hebrew Bible. And when we open up our New Testament, it's already over.
I was
And
about to
so,
say prophets are pretty gray area for me in the Christian
yeah,
faith.
I kind of want to go back to one of my earlier statements.
Yeah, we're getting
How
pretty off track.
No, no, it's fine. Just because it's relevant to your last statement, um, how New Testament professors and Old Testament professors at your typical seminaries are trained. They're usually trained in a track that includes the languages for that testament, the theologies that are coming from that testament. What I mean by that is theological concepts, and then that's how they build their professorship. And most people that are New Testament professors, Old Testament professors, don't know what the other one does.
You would think you'd be taught on the whole Bible.
Well, the problem is it takes too long for a person to train equally well in both.
Mm,
Um, and let's say, for example, your typical Master's of Divinity degree is, well, it used to be 90 hours. It's now 72 credit hours. Um, Once they lowered the standard to 72, nobody's going to offer a 90 anymore. But even at the 90-hour one, if you think about credit hours, a typical class is 3 hours. So with a 90 credit hour program, you're going to take 30 total classes, no more. A language sequence, to do a language well, you're going to take 2, 3 credit hours of a language. So that's 6 hours. So 2 classes, if you will, of Hebrew. Then you're going to take what's called advanced Hebrew grammar. That's another term, another semester. And then you're going to take something called exegesis. So that's 12 credit hours just getting one basic language sequence down. Um, then you're also going to want to take some books in the specific class on the book of Jonah, a specific class on the book of Genesis, a specific class on Psalms, just so that you have something from the writings, something from the prophets, and something from the Torah. So you get the
mm.
three main divisions of the Hebrew Bible in the training. Well, now you're up to 7 classes out of 30. And the typical person finishing an MDiv also needs things in church history, practical ministries, how to run a
It's a
church
lot.
board, how to understand my own denominational history. That's important, right? And so once you start stacking all these things into a program, you end up with 12 hours at best on one language
Wow.
and 9 hours at best on the books that you need to study in depth.
Yeah.
And so you're sitting at pretty close to most of your degree mapped out for you, and you've only dealt in one of the two.
Yeah.
And the same
Yeah.
is true for the other one.
Something inside of me told me that going to seminary school is just really understanding the whole book of the Bible and full stop, that's it. But you don't think about the history and the languages and the development and then the significance and that it just goes on and on and on. Oh my gosh, that sounds like a lot. Let's go
So,
back to Jewishness and
yeah,
kind of the development, how there was the Torah, the Hebrew, and then there was the New Testament in Greek, tying that together and kind of how we
yeah,
separated, how we went from a Jewish Messiah to a Christian faith.
yes. So the Hebrew books are written in a time period when the Jewish people are using Hebrew as their main language.
Right.
After the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, when they go to Persia, go to Babylon, and then Persia, and then they return to rebuild, the main
A lot of
language is
history
going to
there.
be Aramaic now. Rather than Hebrew, the main language becomes Aramaic. Now, in the region of Jerusalem, Hebrew was still spoken, but most of the land was speaking Aramaic. And then Jerusalem and Judea is still using Hebrew even as far as Jesus' time, but Galilee is not, and the rest of what we know of as Israel is using Aramaic. After the Aramaic introduction, so the some of the books of the Hebrew Bible are actually written in Aramaic if they're written in that time period. So we find the last books written in a different language. About 150 years later, we have someone called Alexander the Great,
This
a
is still
Greek.
before Jesus.
Hmm.
Okay, so now we're like 300 years out from Jesus's birth.
That's right. Right around 330 to 300. Yep. Alexander the Great takes over as the sole ruler in Greece, and Greece has been whipped up on by the Persians a few times. So he decides he's going once and for all and unseat the Persians from power. Well, that means global domination. He goes around and starts mopping up and crushing, and the next thing you know, Persia's flat. It's done. And so he's crushed Persia in several swift series of battles, and he's conquered Egypt. What we know of is Israel, what we know of is Iraq, Iran, and most of the stands, Afghanistan, all of that falls under the Greek Empire that's being built,
And this is like a Persian war, right, between Greece and Persia, essentially, but
essentially.
Christian Jewish faith. So faith was playing a role in this, or was that kind of a
This is
specific
the setting.
reason?
This is a setting for what happens next. What
Mm.
happens next is your next generation of Jewish persons is growing up in a Greek speaking world. And so the language now changes from Aramaic to Greek. Um, so Paul, in his hometown where he grew up, Greek was the spoken language by his time. Where Jesus was growing up, Aramaic was the local language, but people still spoke Greek because they needed to trade outside their borders. And in
Mm.
Jerusalem, Hebrew is the spoken language. So when you went to do the Passover and deal with the priest at the temple, you had to switch from Aramaic to Hebrew. But when you went up north to visit Jews in Turkey, you had to switch to Greek. So when the time of the New Testament comes around, most of the Jewish speaking world is actually speaking Greek. Only a relatively few are speaking Hebrew. And
Wow.
something took place about 150 years after Alexander the Great's conquest. The whole Jewish world pretty much is using Greek so much that the rabbis get together, and there was some influence from an outside source as well, but they approved a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and we call that the Septuagint. It's also called the LXX. So this Greek Bible is the one that takes us forward into the first century when Jesus is growing up and the apostles are going around building the church. Most of their quotations inside the New Testament of the Old Testament passages are actually in the Greek Septuagint. They're quoting the
Got
Greek.
it. Got it.
That's
And
probably 96% anyway. That's the rough number.
this is inclusive of those books that were taken out of, I forgot the name.
the Apocrypha or the other ones that weren't actually ever called Apocrypha, the Second Temple Jewish literature. Some of them were cited, some of them were just mentioned.
Mm,
Sometimes a detail would be mentioned because it was popularly known stuff.
mm,
Um, and so, let's say, for example, we had a book years ago written called Moby Dick. We did. We could make a reference to it today and said, "Oh, that happened just like it did in Moby Dick," right? So Moby Dick was a big whaler story about in the 1800s, right near the end of the whaling industry. So it was kind of a story to wake people up and maybe stop the whaling abuses, right? We wouldn't need a story like that today because people aren't really doing that, but we still remember that story and we reference it. Another example could be like saying, "Oh, that happened just like Gone with the Wind," and we cite a famous movie. But
mm.
or this happened just like Star Wars, right?
These are great examples.
And so in the New Testament, they're going to reference things from well-known literature, and
Yeah,
this literature was well enough known that it got these offhand allusions.
yeah.
Um, and sometimes ideas in them would be even expanded on in the New Testament sometimes. The other thing that we see with some of the maybe we just call them extra books, maybe we call them uh, Second Temple Jewish literature. That's my favorite word for it,
Okay.
um, because the Jewish community was who was using them, and they were after the Second Temple was built, which was Zerubbabel's temple, after the rebuild from when Cyrus tells the Jews to go back and rebuild the wall, the city, and the temple. A person named Zerubbabel rebuilds and makes a new temple. It was said it wasn't as good as Solomon's, but it was still good, and people rejoiced that were younger because they hadn't seen one yet. People that were older wept because they knew Solomon's was way better than that. And so, there were people of different generations having different responses to it. But that temple is the one that's still around when Jesus comes in, right? So Zerubbabel's temple was kind of simpler, plainer, but the guy named Herod the Great restructured it, rebuilt it, made it beautiful again. So by the time Jesus actually arrives, it's been beautified. So it doesn't look as bad as it did to that first generation that saw it. So that's what we mean by Second Temple. It was
Got it.
built by Zerubbabel, re-beautified by Herod the Great, and then it was destroyed in 70 AD 70. So that's the Second Temple. So from the time of its being built until AD 70, that period is called Second Temple Judaism. And literature written in that includes these books. So how do we go from a Hebrew Torah to Greek Gospels has a lot to do with the fact that the Jewish people themselves are speaking different languages in different millennia,
Because of
social circumstances,
wars. Yeah.
wars and conquests, and who are the rulers now, that sort of thing.
Running my own podcast, I'm always moving too fast. I'm finding guests, I'm editing episodes, I'm creating reels, or guesting on other shows. Not to mention, I just live in a world that moves fast. Notifications, trends, endless to-do lists. You know what feels like a blessing in all that? Slowing down. I'd love nothing more than a moment to pause, be present, and choose something timeless. That's exactly what Dwell Label is all about. When I first discovered Dwell Label, it wasn't just about the clothes, it was about a mindset. Thoughtful, intentional fashion that doesn't scream for attention, but instead invites you to slow down. Their pieces are modern takes on classic styles, made to last, not just for the season, but for years. I love that I can throw on a Dwell Label outfit for editing in a coffee shop, Bible studies, or looking professional in an interview. It always feels right. Comfortable, effortless, elevated. And here's the best part. Dwell Label does not just talk about rest. They live it. Their website literally doesn't work on Sundays because they believe in pausing and dwelling on what matters most. So if you're looking for high quality, timeless fashion that aligns with a lifestyle of intention and presence, I can't recommend Dwell Label enough. Shop Dwell Label with the link in the show notes and use my code BIBSPEAK15, BIBSPEAK15 for an exclusive discount at checkout. Take a breath, slow down, and dwell in the good things. Now, back to the show. Okay, so that explains why there's two separate languages. But I guess what was the bridge between Jewish and Christian then?
Yeah, that one is more difficult to explain, but going into the earlier what I was saying about the two tracks, Old Testament professors have their track and New Testament professors have their track. This
Right.
kind of thing has been happening for several hundred years inside Christian circles. And because of that, New Testament professors are usually unaware of what Old Testament professors are dealing with and the text they are reading. And Old Testament professors are often unaware of what's the New Testament is doing because that's not part of their program of study. That
Huh.
wasn't something they developed expertise in. So what happens over time is that if you're ignorant about something, you tend to say things about that other thing that aren't quite accurate. And these things don't really get tested or proved or adjusted because nobody's checking.
Mm, yeah.
And then very few people have the expertise to critique these things because who's going to do a double MDiv? One in Old Testament, one in New Testament. It doesn't happen. And when I went and did my MDiv, I did a double major, which is similar. But what it meant is I had to substitute things out of my degree program in order to do both Hebrew and Greek, do both Greek exegesis and Hebrew exegesis, study intensely Greek New Testament books and Hebrew Old Testament books at a pretty high level of depth, and study the critical issues that scholars have raised for both the New Testament and the Old Testament. That's a massive thing in and of itself. But by doing that, I had to uh, cut out courses that were maybe, I don't know, practical ministry related or church history related. I did study history I love history, so I always was going to anchor myself in the historical things as they develop. That was not a I never needed a degree in history to want to learn history, but um, I felt like there's some things I can learn on my own. There's some things I need pushed to learn. And if I'm going to get a grasp of how the New Testament and Old Testament relate to each other, I need to study both
Yeah.
carefully. And I think in my whole seminary experience, there was only one other person I knew of that did that. So there's, and he's my friend. We go to conferences together, and um, we live not too far from each other as it happens. But it's rare because you have to give up something in the degree program if you
Yeah.
want to get both of these tracks. Or else you have to do 2 degrees and convince somebody that you need to do 2 degrees of the same apparent level.
Yeah.
And that's hard to do. And a typical person who's deciding to be a pastor of a church also would go get an MDiv, but they're going to concentrate more on practical ministries because of the social issues that face the church. They need to study some things that uh, a scholar wouldn't find helpful. And so I was pretty much on the track that was for scholars rather than pastors. But I was a pastor and I was pastoring. But um, where I was in my ministry context, I felt that I was well equipped in the pastoral role, and I didn't need to do an MDiv in practical ministries to
Got
do
it.
that. Um, yes, I will have limitations in that area, but I also find that my main role is as a pastor isn't being the lead pastor generally. I could be if I need to be, but that's not my main role. My main role is in discipleship and equipping ministries. I've also been trained to be a chaplain as well, and sometimes a church needs a chaplain. And if a church is a rather large church with many people in hospital or nursing home, sometimes having a chaplain on staff is the best way to go. And
So
to
that be
make
a Catholic faith?
no, it's chaplains can be of any denomination and
Oh,
any group. But what a chaplain is a person who can go into a healthcare facility who's been certified to be in a healthcare environment and provide religious services to people who need it, and advice and counseling to anyone who asks for it.
wow.
So I've done that a large number of my years.
Wow. I feel like I'm
I
talking
first
to one
got,
of the most educated people in the Bible.
well, I don't know that necessarily, but one of the things that I see is where we have our typical degree program set up and what our typical seminary shoots for. Don't create a person who's capable of moving between both Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament and connecting the dots.
So that is a bit of a lacking in the connection for like understanding the Bible as a whole, especially on a simple level for someone like me who wants to know the highest level. I just want to know the cream skimmed off the top. That requires so much depth and knowledge and understanding that is a very big undertaking for somebody. So maybe us as
It's
Christians,
massive. Yeah.
when we have questions, maybe we're asking a legitimate question, but to fully answer it correctly takes a level of schooling that not everybody has.
And probably not one that most pastors have. And I don't know what the number would be, but
It's crazy.
if I look at my own band of pastors that I'm part of, there's probably 3 of us out of 100 that know our biblical Greek, and maybe 2 of us out of 100 that know our biblical Hebrew, and only
Well,
one of us that knows both, and that would be me. But that's typical, actually. That's not unusual.
right, right. No,
I,
that's just
I've,
news to me.
I've heard a lot of pastors say, "Well, they put me through Greek in seminary," but that statement belies a simple problem. They didn't learn their Greek in seminary. They learned it quickly and forgot it quickly,
Mm,
and so they aren't using it, and they can't use it to ferret out things. Um,
right.
they
So
will
there's
have to ask
misunderstanding
somebody.
and misinterpretation issues that they're then feeding to their congregation.
It probably shouldn't happen to that extreme level. It can. Um, I think most pastors ground themselves in the theological traditions of their denomination,
Okay.
and somebody within their structure would know enough to steer them away from really big pitfalls.
Yeah.
And usually, people who have stumbled into a pitfall and wrote a book about it, usually their book gets critiqued at their conferences, so they know some of the things that are out there and how to avoid them. So I think most pastors avoid the extremes of that by being connected to other people who are looking out for problems. But it is potentially possible for a pastor to mislead people. But the place where I think it happens unavoidably is not any serious misleading, but when we depend too much on a tradition to interpret the Bible for us, then we're eventually become blind to counter evidence.
Ooh, go on. I want to take a moment to highlight the platform that's revolutionizing the way that people learn about the Word of God: school. When I first started this podcast, my goal was very simple. I wanted to equip people with clear, accessible, biblical understanding through scholars. But I quickly realized that podcasting alone wasn't enough. I wanted to create a space where people could actually connect and learn and dive deeper beyond just listening. That's when I found School. School is the most user-friendly platform I've ever come across. It's built by Sam Ovens with insights from business minds like Alex Hermosi. School combines the best of online education, coaching, and community in one place. It's intuitive, powerful, and it connects you to a global network of learners and teachers. That's why I launched Biblically Heard, a place where you can chat with scholars, take courses from beginner to expert level, and even connect with me directly. So if you're looking to build a coaching business or launch an online course or create an engaged community, School beats out every other tool. It combines the best of Patreon-style tiered services and Telegram-style community feeds. It's a seamless scheduling tool with integrations with Zapier, Zoom, and even Google Calendar. If this sounds like the right platform for you, please use my affiliate link in the show notes below to get started. It won't cost you anything extra, and it keeps this channel going. Now, back to the show.
So sometimes there's a little fact that's just there that's bothering you, but you don't know how to deal with it. So it's like it seems like it could unravel one of my points that I might want to make. But if no one in my circle of folks that I'm bouncing ideas off of develops this thing, eventually it gets explained.
You're gonna have to use an example. You're kind of losing me.
Yeah, I'm not thinking of an example while I'm saying it. I'm just aware of the problem, so I apologize for that.
Would
But
you say like a tradition? I immediately thought of a Jewish tradition, kind of, the bathing tradition, or what?
sure, I can explain a little better. When I'm referring to a tradition of Christian practice, I'm referring to things like what a major denomination would be. That would be a particular tradition to think about the Bible from. So,
Oh
couple
gosh,
of
I have like Catholic
examples.
examples.
Well, yeah, so we could say, well, according to the Catholic tradition, we think about the Bible this way. According to the Calvinist tradition, we think about the Bible this way.
I
According
don't even
to
know what
the
that is.
So John Calvin was one of the reformers in the early modern period who was trying to reform some of the Catholic things in his day to something different. And so he was one of the reformers. Martin Luther was another reformer.
Okay,
And so but they both knew each other. They both were around at the same time, but they're in two different countries. And so there's a system of thought that's called Calvinist that develops from John Calvin's thought. And so there's a Calvinist way of thinking
all
about
right,
Scripture.
yeah, I'm back on track.
Then there's a Wesleyan way of thinking about Scripture, and that was based on another later person who comes along to kind of counter some of the rough edges of the reformers as well as keep reforming the church. And that man's name was John Wesley. He was an Anglican priest, never left the Anglican church, never went out and started his own group, so to speak. But it wasn't long after his death till his followers did. And so then they founded what we later know of as Methodism. So that's the way of thinking. So within different, maybe we can think of it this way, there's different schools of thought on how to read and interpret the Bible.
Absolutely,
And if a person belongs to one of these schools of thought, they tend to think about scripture the same way.
absolutely.
So that's where I'm coming from. And if let's say a pastor belongs to one of these schools of thought, maybe that's a better word than tradition. So they're going to tend to think about scripture that same way.
But you said that there was an issue, maybe if they tie themselves to a fact that goes unnoticed and goes uncorrected. So are you saying, I mean, are you saying that maybe in the past there's been something in a certain faith that that school of thought tied themselves to that ended up being either untrue or problematic or not actually adhering to the core of the Christian faith?
Well, I don't know if it goes to those extremes, but what would happen is that sometimes you've got, I don't know, 200 items that are facts. And so what your job is as a theologian is to weave all of these facts together into like a tapestry where they make sense together.
Okay.
So I'm using metaphors here, and I'm not thinking of concrete examples, but a job as a theologian is to make all of these seemingly random facts work together as a comprehensive whole. So then when you preach sermons on it, you can connect them to the fabric and say, well, this thought's related to that spot in the fabric. This one's related to that thought in the fabric. And that's nice. But occasionally there's one of those little facts that just you can't decide where to fit it in the fabric. It doesn't fit neat over here. It doesn't fit neat over here. Try to fit it down here. It doesn't work so well. And eventually the tendency is, well, it doesn't fit our fabric the way we've thought of it. So we'll try to give an explanation for that random fact that we can't fit. And here's our explanation, and we're going to move on. Tradition A will do that with some little facts. If they can't seem to make them work in the fabric, they'll give explanations and move on. Someone else will say, well, those are the primary things I want to work into my fabric. They work up another fabric, a different traditional way of understanding scripture.
Doesn't
And
even
then
sound
they,
like Christian faith anymore.
well, what we're dealing with is the thinking mind trying to grasp all of the nuggets of truth and make them fit.
Yeah.
That's what we're dealing with. And sometimes there's a tendency, if one is always interpreting within one's school of thought, to kind of ignore the little facts that don't fit the fabric so nice.
Mm.
And that's where I think the separation mentally between Jewishness and Christianity has happened.
Whoa. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. That was
I
a
don't think it
epic
was
lead up.
intentional. Yeah, and there was a lot of things that had to fit into place to make that work. But this is historically how the Jewishness eventually gets stripped off of what we call Christianity and sold as a marketplace religion
So
without the
this
Jewish
wasn't
elements
like
in it.
it wasn't like a war where like the ending of
No,
the war kind of split a bunch of people. This was like a gradual diaspora of people that just slowly began to reference themselves to a different school of thought than their previous Jewish community.
that's part of it. And there's also some basic,
It's difficult for me to, I guess, correct me because I'm thinking if I and my grandmother and my great grandmother, my entire family was Jewish, and
mhm.
then and they saw I don't know. I guess like if you're Jewish and then you meet the Messiah because you're alive during that time, and then he dies and rises on the third day, and there's that those miracles throughout his life. Generations later, you slowly separate yourself from that. Isn't the core difference between Jewish and Christian is that Jews don't believe that he is the Messiah? So am I getting the timing wrong?
No, that's basically how it, and I wouldn't say all of the Jews. I would say some of the Jews that would fit the profile because some Jews did believe he was the Messiah. So
Got it.
you have that division among ethnic Jews. And the other thing is when we go back into about the so I'm going to kind of switch gears here
Yeah.
and label a couple of other things historically that may have helped speed up the fracture
Mm.
between help strip away, if you will, the Jewishness from our understanding of the New Testament. One of those things happens right around the 400s. The
After Jesus was born.
after, right. So in the earlier centuries, Jewish communities and Christian communities were constantly discussing these things with each other.
Okay.
This was we can find documents about this. And yeah, there were some instances where somebody says, okay, you're not welcome here. You got that idea. We don't want you here. And that kind of thing happened, but it wasn't large scale or widespread. This was down to the individual synagogue having a fuss.
Okay.
So, and this could happen over any issue, not just a Messiah related issue. If somebody was a seller of something at the marketplace and their business had hurt someone else's business that was the donor to the synagogue, they might not be welcome at that synagogue, right? So random things could cause disfellowshipping, and we see examples of disfellowshipping happen. There were certainly some times when the Jewish synagogues that did not want to accept Jesus as the Messiah maybe would reject somebody coming in that preached that message.
I
And then there was
see.
other Jewish synagogues that welcomed the discussion and continued the discussion, did not convert to Christianity, so to speak. And then there were others that did. So
And those Christianity communities were like, we want the whole New Testament and the Torah and the Old
yeah.
Testament, whereas maybe the people that were rejecting were saying, we'll just stick with the Torah.
And here's another thing that goes in with that. Most early churches did not have a New Testament in their church. They only had the Hebrew Bible.
So they were just Jewish.
They were sometimes they were started with ethnic Jewish community members, but many times, even when the community shifted to Gentile believers, non-Jewish believers, they would have still only had the Hebrew Bible as their Bible. They would have had
Okay.
collections of Gospels, maybe collections of Paul's letters, maybe. And we're saying maybe because the spreading of these documents takes some time.
Yeah.
And it's not until around the year 360 that we actually have a document with a list of all the New Testament books on it. So it's years before somebody uh, decides, okay, we need to actually set a limit on what's in the New Testament and what's out. And
And that would
uh,
be the council.
and that was the next council, right? So the earlier council we talked about was the Jewish council deciding the books of what we now call the Old Testament. This
Okay.
council, close to the year 400, is the one that decides which books belong to the New Testament. So some of this stuff is still up in the air in terms of which book is accepted, which book is not. the until that gets decided. But the thing is it was unanimously decided. So when the decision was reached, the list was cut off at 27 and no more. There were a few contenders. For example, the a book called Shepherd of Hermas, another book called Didache, a third book. Um, Slip in my mind now the name of it. My mind's tired. But those two books at least were strong contenders. A lot of churches liked them, but they weren't universally accepted. And eventually, if they weren't universally accepted, they weren't included in the official canon. They still were
Oh.
recommended for good reading. So that
Universally, so were they, how were they polling that globally from their own community? Did they just have representatives from different
yeah,
nations that kind of said, oh, okay, cool, cool.
like your your big city churches would have started satellite churches in all the smaller cities. And so the leader in the big city church would have been the representative that voted. So
Got it.
so
Okay.
you're dealing with a sort of a hierarchical level of church leadership that was
Yeah.
around in that time, and the leaders would have been sent to the council to vote. But the decision was actually reached before they voted. It was as the data was coming in, they had absolutely no dissenters from the list. So without a decision, it was already decided.
Oh.
There really wasn't any different decisions when that was uh, put to a vote.
And this was just within the Christian slash Jewish community. This wasn't like representatives of Taoism and
No,
Buddhism
no,
and yeah, okay. Yeah. I don't want to get off course, but I just wanted to
no.
check.
Yeah, so yeah, this was there would have been Jewish persons still in the in the Christian communities, but by the 400s, you've had several things happen. You've had the late 300s, I want to say, rather than 400. First of all, the first Roman emperor comes to the throne who declares Christianity as his religion. That's
I'm sorry, say
happened.
that again.
The first Roman emperor to declare Christianity as his religion comes to the throne.
What would the religion would have been before?
It would have been the Roman pantheon of Jupiter and the 12 gods and goddesses, with
Oh.
Caesar being the one worshipped as the primary god.
Oh. Okay, so that's a big deal.
It's a big switcheroo. And so his name is Constantine, and when he comes to rule, his mother had been converted to Christ. And so when he decided he actually was appointed because what happened with the Roman Empire in this period, there's a lot of fuss. And so instead of having one emperor try to rule it, they tried to rule it with four. Just have one person in each corner of the
Okay.
empire running a fourth of it. And that kind of brings that some of the other biblical passages from the four corners of the world to a new level of meaning when you've got four rulers ruling each their own corner.
Yeah.
And so he actually is sympathetic to the Christian cause. Most of the emperors had persecuted Christians and Jews alike up until this point. Sometimes some emperors were heavier on their Jewish persecution, some were heavier on the Christians, but both of them got persecuted. Um, so he comes to the throne and he is Christian. That's what he decides. And he actually has the cross painted on all his shields of his soldiers and everything just to make a big point. And it seems like his conversion was as serious as any could be estimated looking at historical resources. He definitely opposes the Roman, what we might call pagan system of worship,
Yeah,
puts
yeah.
it, but that's the only step he makes. Two emperors later, that person makes Christianity the only legal religion to practice, making all others illegal.
Whoa.
And so between the two of them, they put the nails in the coffin on the pagan religion. But by the time that the second decision is reached, now persecution of the Christians is over, but the sometimes intensifies the persecution for the Jews
Oh, because Jewish faith is now illegal.
if it's not Christian.
So, whoa. So that was like the first account of anti-Semitism, you'd say?
Not the first instance of it, but the first instance of it under a Christian emperor's decision.
Wow. So it really, I This is so interesting. I thought that anti-Semitism was based in like the color of our skin or like, the status, like economic status, but it really came from the preference of the leader at the time.
The leader kind of made things happen. Now,
Whoa.
there were fusses because, as you can realize, non-Christian Jews and Christian Jews would disagree about the Messiah. So
Hmm.
we can expect that. Gentile Christians would also disagree with non-Christian Jews about the Messiah. So there was enough things to cause disagreement between peoples. But when
Sounds like a lot of half
Constantine's,
and half. Which ones do you persecute?
right, both being persecuted at the same time,
Mm.
the intermingling of the communities was more happening. There were
Mm.
several things in history that caused division to increase.
Yeah.
But once this happens, it becomes very comfortable for Christian circles to say, "Oh, finally an end to the persecution. What's the cost? Oh, our fellow minglers are getting persecuted more.
Mm.
Is it okay to be comfortable here, or should they stand out and say something?" The saddest thing is we don't read about the kind of
Whoa.
thing we would like to read about in the 400s and even going into 500. The
This
the
is taking
rivalry
place
was
in the
so fierce.
400 years
Yeah,
following Jesus' death.
and so there was a lot of animosity happening inside the Roman Empire as it's starting to crumble, because the Roman Empire has a great fall all about this same time. 495, Rome got sacked. So we're looking at some serious issues on the horizon for the Roman Empire at the same time that these big rivalries are starting to shape up.
I'm
And
not
we
so
can
good as
read,
history with you, but who did they get sacked by?
yeah, this is going to be um, different invading groups with the Huns and the Goths, and
Got it.
this kind of thing is going to start happening, and it's not going to stop.
Got it. So it's
Eventually,
a full from all sides fall. Got it.
yeah, and the Lombardians are in there somewhere. So they're another invading Germanic tribe that comes in and bashes.
Lombardians. That's
Yeah, the
never heard that.
Lombardians. Yeah, those are the Germanic tribes that have descendants now in northern Italy.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so it's one of the reason Italy has three colors in its flag. The three colors represent the three major people groups that occupy Italy. The top
Oh,
people group are the Lombardian invaders from the 5 and 600s. The middle band is the native Roman Italians, and the bottom band is the Norman invaders that come from Normandy to invade them later.
I thought it was because it represented the three ingredients in pasta sauce, celery, carrots, onion.
That's the specific colors, but why three? It's because there's been, for a long time anyway, three different peoples populating Italy. And
Okay.
they link back to these two invasions, the Norman invasion of South Italy and the Lombardian invasion of North Italy. Well, this is the kind of thing that puts lots of pressure on the Emperor of Rome, and he has to make peace with the barbarians somehow, any way he can. He's losing everything, and so there's a lot of attempts. And some of the earlier attempts were to try to bribe the barbarians away, and they bankrupted their own selves doing it. So large chests of money can only come out so often, right? And if it's enough to bribe away a major invasion, that has to be a lot of money. And the very first, and it almost seems, well, that's another story I don't want to develop here, but this is where the Pope becomes powerful because the leader of state decides to avoid the responsibility and sends out the church leader to do it instead. And so eventually the power of the state leader, the emperor, lands on the Pope instead of the emperor. Towards the end, the emperor abdicates and the Pope is running everything. That's
So
why we
the
have a
emperor.
powerful medieval Pope.
So you're saying he decided Christian faith, a lot of power, a lot of violence. He put that power onto the Pope and then eventually just kind of stepped down and the Pope stepped up.
Over many generations of the emperor. Not the
Yeah.
same person, but yeah. And so the first Christian emperor made Christianity legal. Yippee yay. We're not going to get persecuted so badly now.
Hmm.
Two emperors later, he made it the only legal That guy made it the only legal religion. Now the persecution's landing on everybody but the Christians, including the pagans, which they weren't persecuted before. No reason that they needed to be persecuted, but they were. And then the
Persecutors and like jailed.
lots of different stuff, actually, and some of it a lot more horrid than jail.
Got it. Okay.
You know, some people would lose their lives, some people would get tortured, some people would get banished, sent to the salt mines, a lot of different cruel punishments.
Okay.
Um, and persecution can be varied. It can be just, oh, you guys can't trade here, but our buddies can. That could be a form of
Wow.
persecution. That's milder, but it's still real. And economic
Yeah.
suppression is a big thing. That was
Yeah.
also something. So the issues between Christians and non-Christian Jewish groups, uh, they begin to separate in reality so much by the 500s that they're no longer communicating across that line, analyzing text together, examining things, and the two communities um, end up separated quite a bit after that. Some of this is because of the emperor and the emperor's decision. Some of this is because communities didn't find a way to reach out in spite of the emperor and still have fellowship. A lot of things we can point at, but the 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 core problem here is that once the leadership of the church moves from a Jewish leadership, because under the New Testament every church leader is a Jew,
Hmm.
to Gentile leaders, there's it's not immediate, it's not right away, and it's not a cause really. It's just a consequence along the chain of events. But as
Yeah.
the leadership moves to Gentile shoulders, they don't read the Hebrew. We can read church fathers that barely could grasp
Oh
something
my
from the
gosh.
Hebrew
Yeah.
text. They're reading
Wow.
the Greek, and then by the 400s, the church fathers are struggling to read their Greek.
Whoa.
They need it in Latin or they can't read it.
It
Now
all
we
ties
have
together.
And so we have the beginning of people being involved in church leadership and the training of church leaders as well, who don't read Hebrew, who don't read Greek. They're reading Latin. And some of the problems of the church as a result are that people are reading only the Latin translation, deciding things about Christian faith and deciding things about what to do with the Jews that aren't based on looking at the older texts. They're based at looking at Latin translations and also traditional thinking. It's not just the Latin translation; it's traditional thinking. You take these problems a few generations later, and that's why you have a Reformation. There were people who were fed up with this, tired of this, and they wanted to reform things. At the time the Reformation happens, there were instances in some of just to pull one serious incident out of the hat is the Spanish Inquisition. And it's only named Spanish because there's so many famous trials in Spain, but it's not limited to Spain. The Spanish Inquisition was anybody who dissented from the line item list of things that were considered important by the Christian leaders. If they dissented on any single point, they could actually lose their life.
Dissented as in saying, I don't believe in that.
Right, or it should be thought of this way instead of the way you thought of it. That would be dissension, and that could end up in somebody losing their life.
Whoa. Oh my gosh. This is crazy. I don't want to get too far because I just want to backtrack a second. That makes complete sense. That it kind of feels like that scene in Game of Thrones when you realize there's a whole war because of one tiny misunderstanding. You know, I don't know if you watch the show, but there was that one pivotal moment where you're like, this didn't need to happen. But it seemed like this times 1,000 that very slowly over time, we just slowly drifted. And I see why it makes sense. But that is, wow. One thing though is so Christians, they don't know the language, they can't reference it. They're moving forward full speed ahead with their New Testament in Greek. But how come the Jews didn't move forward referencing the New Testament? Or was that kind of the whole thing? Is they're like, we never were going to. So there's not a point, like they weren't going to be the connector anyways.
I think originally the the not Christian Jewish community did interact with the documents of the New Testament. But I think after a while, that wasn't deemed so important or so necessary because these books later became associated with the individuals who would torment them, persecute them, and individuals who would run the Inquisition. And so, why would you want to invest years of studying these documents when they aren't important to your understanding of the Torah, and they aren't
Mm,
important to they're important for your oppressor, not the and so this kind of thing also led to, in many circles, maybe Jewish persons being less familiar with the New Testament documents, as we call them, New Testament documents. But there are such things as Hebrew Gospels and um, Hebrew books of the New Testament. There's groups of people who are studying them. Some of them have been recovered. Some of them have been kept alive by those who wanted to study the Hebrew ones instead of the Greek ones. And so there's some groups that are studying them to see what came down through the Jewish tradition about the New Testament. And so this kind of thing is studied today. Um, I know very little about it except some of the people who are doing it. And it's fascinating to me, and I hope to take a look at some of these documents if I get a chance. I've always been fascinated by how did we get our gospels in the first place?
yeah.
And there's a lot of unanswered questions. There was a convention of scholars in the 1800s that was a multinational, international is the right word, international group of scholars from many countries and languages who tried to solve the problem. How did we get our gospels? And they started at this point and argued their way successively through a number of generations through several points and eventually concluded they were back at the starting point and they didn't have an answer and they disbanded. And we're talking about scholars who put their life's work into this, lived and died, and their successor in their chair continuing their work, and then that person's successor continuing the work, only to realize we're back at the beginning. No
That
answer. And so today, when you ask New Testament scholars, how did we get our gospel? What's the answer to the synoptic problem? You get about 300 answers.
yeah, they're like, shut up. We're not going there.
Well, they'll give you their answer, but they know that this is a widely disagreed upon topic, and there does not seem to be a consensus. The funny thing is we can find little random statements in the earliest references to our gospels in the among the church fathers before this time period of the 400s that we were mentioning, that the way that they received their gospels is they got Matthew in Greek, Luke in Greek, John in Greek, Matthew in Hebrew, not Greek. And that fact has escaped most of the people that have tried to solve the problem.
Why that one in Hebrew?
Don't know. That's just the way that the earliest reporters on receiving the Gospels got them. And if Matthew was received in Hebrew, and then Mark, Luke, and John were received in Greek, and then hundreds of years later we start analyzing Greek Matthew, Greek Mark, Luke, and John, and trying to figure out which one came first, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and we're looking at Matthew, and our earliest sources say it wasn't written in Greek to begin with, it was written in Hebrew. What we're
Mm,
looking at is a translation.
mm,
We have to be. And
yeah.
how can we compare a translation while trying to say it's first? It can't be first if it's translation. And so I think that particular piece, if it was properly assessed in some of the gospel theories, would revamp how they think of the problem. It can't be
Wait,
solved
can you
yet.
say that again, but
Yeah,
simpler? My brain did not
yeah.
understand that.
So, for example, maybe I can go into this a little bit. The There's people that think Matthew was written first and Luke written second, and then Mark abridges both of them into a smaller gospel.
Okay.
There's people that think Mark was written first, Matthew expanded it, and then Luke expanded it a different way.
Okay.
So these are two prominent theories. When we start looking at the text, Luke seems to be more like Hebrew translated into Greek than the others do. It seems like there's places in Luke's document that the original wording was in Hebrew. But these are usually in places where he's reporting what someone told him. So we're dealing with the words of Mary, both before Jesus' birth and after his resurrection, that kind of thing. And so maybe he's just has an oral report from her and he's recorded it there, and that would explain why that the features look that way. The there are long places in those three gospels where there's verbatim agreement between the passages talking about the same story. And then there's places where one gospel will go on at a stretch and the other one skips right over that part. And it's like when you see them having verbatim agreements, you don't think, oh, they picked up the same stuff from somewhere. What you think is, oh, they're copying from the other document. Because how did they get it word for word, 36 words in a row?
You're right.
That's too much to expect out of somebody who's just remembering an event
That's
20
true.
years
Yeah.
later.
Oh,
So it's one of those kind of things, and it's really stumped the scholars. But what if the Gospels weren't originally written in Greek, and what we're looking at is translations, or at least a translation of Matthew? Then it makes sense why Matthew's looking at a document and copying what's in it. He's his job, not Matthew personally, but whoever translated Hebrew Matthew into Greek. So he would say, well, okay, this part is already done in Mark. All I got to do is look at Mark, and I can write the words down.
yeah.
I don't have to think through and translate this part exactly, or do my own fresh translation of it. In other words, I can write
Yeah.
what's in Mark, and so that would explain instances where they have word for word things,
Yeah.
and it doesn't put the burden on trying to figure out which one came first when the evidence goes both ways.
Right. I
Um,
uh I embarrassingly have to admit that I've been a Christian for my entire life, stronger at sometimes than others, but I didn't know, especially not from church, that the gospels were just four different perspectives on the same events. That there are
okay.
four different viewpoints on Jesus's life told from different people's perspectives. And, Luke was more of the journalist, whereas, John was
Yep.
more the right hand guy at some points. I didn't know that. I honestly thought they were four different points in history or people living their lives, four different stories completely. And I don't know. I feel like for any young Christian listening, like if you didn't know that, now you do, because I definitely didn't know that for the longest time.
Yeah. And that's the amazing way to think about the four gospels as four different perspectives on Jesus's life told by four different people who had different walks in life.
Yeah.
So you've got one guy's a fisherman, actually two of them really are. One's a medical doctor and one's a tax collector. So imagine if your local IRS agent, um, your doctor that you go see for general practice, and two folks you found fishing one day all get together and write something on the same thing. They're not going to say the same thing the same way. It's
I'm
not
so
going to
glad you
happen.
put it that way.
Yeah, you've got two very highly educated individuals in completely different fields. One's
Yeah.
in finance, the other's in medical practice.
Yeah.
And then two people who are very experienced in a particular thing of life, like fishing, but they're not highly educated formally in any given
Right.
subject.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when they get together on something, there's going to be points of difference. Um,
Right.
yeah.
And then when it's transcribed, you're going to do kind of not shortcuts, but the things that make sense to copy. um, wow. I am so glad that you are so well read in this, not just on the Bible and the translations, but in the history lesson of it. And this is a little bit my fault, but I have good and bad news.
Okay.
The bad news is we didn't get to the original topic we were going to talk about today.
Yes.
We didn't even touch on it, but the good news is that we can have another call on it. And
Yeah.
this call today is something that I have been hungry to have, because I didn't know how I was going to get answers to that question of how did we go from Jewish to Christian? What was the difference? And I feel so enlightened about it now. And I'm also having meetings with a rabbi, and I was going to have his take as well. But, he is a messianic rabbi. So I
Hmm.
feel like it's going to be a completely different perspective. But this is such an important conversation. And this history lesson just made sense. I think that there's no room for opinions because it was just historical facts.
And the other thing that I would want to leave us with as we think about tonight is there have always been Jewish persons that didn't necessarily convert to Christianity per se, that interacted with Christian documents throughout the centuries. And there's always been Christian individuals as well that tried their best to learn Hebrew and interacted with Jewish sources. Sometimes both individuals were largely ignored.
Mm,
One book that I have just gotten and anxious to read is a book by Rabbi Soloveitchik, and
okay.
he was a person in the late 1800s, I think. I'm not sure if I have the century quite right or the decade quite right, but he analyzed the Christian Gospels that were retained inside Jewish circles, that is non-Christian Jewish circles. And he analyzed them and talked about what they meant to a Jewish reader. And his book was published at that same time, but his works were largely ignored until more recently when somebody did some work and translation work on his book. I think I don't know if it was German or Austrian, but or French, but it's one of those that survived. Uh, Basically, some of his work was lost in the Holocaust, but one of the surviving pieces of his work was recently translated into English, and it's the next thing on my reading list because he
Oh,
talks about Hebrew Gospels and Hebrew books for other New Testament passages as well that have been studied through the years inside Jewish circles that were non-Christian Jewish circles. I'm emphasizing that because I don't want to say that Jewish and Christian is separate. There have always been Jewish Christians, Gentile Christians, and non-Christian Jews. So all three have existed throughout time.
whoa. So far reaching and so much to consume. Again, like you mentioned, how it's so difficult for people to speak on these topics because the depth of the New Testament equals the depth of the Old Testament. But I really appreciate your ability to shine light on both and then also to be able to highlight the gaps, that already exist today. I think this is a really fully encompassing perspective and really good for people like me who are starting with nothing. And this is really educating and enlightening and interesting.
In that Spanish Inquisition I was mentioning earlier, and it goes by other names as it leaves Spain and moves to other regions, a lot of Jewish books were burned because they were considered not in line with the current thought, and therefore they needed to be burned. The problem with that is some copies of Jewish Gospels were actually burned too, in some of that, and some of that has been recorded in in the among Jewish rabbis that kept track of these things. So I think Rabbi Soloveitchik also mentions some of the effects of this Inquisition on, strangely enough, Jewish Gospels that would help explain some of the things scholars are wrestling all this time in the Gospels, but yet they're easily explained if somebody wouldn't have tried to burn the books.
Wow. Kind of like the worms eating the paper. Like sometimes, like events in life impacted the way history played out. Even though it did happen, in our world, it didn't because we just don't have the proof of it because it was burned or eaten by a worm. The context of it is has degraded.
Yeah, and sometimes that kind of thing has produced a difficulty for biblical scholars to recognize and grapple because they're unaware of the things that have happened in history. And now
Yeah.
they think it's this instead of that, but in reality, the explanation can be simple if we don't lose sight of what has happened in history.
And have faith in, maybe you don't have 100% of it, but still you have to have faith that you're a part of something that you can lean on and trust and has your
Yes,
best intention at heart. Wow.
yes.
Well, Dr. James Sedlacek, thank you so much for joining again.
Oh, you're welcome. Happy to do it. And one of these days we'll get to talk about why the woman had faith in when she reached out and touched his hem of his garment.
Yes, yes, that will happen soon. But until now, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
We'll talk soon. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good evening.